Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for taking time this morning. You are in the From Compliance to Chaos to Collaboration, the Tech Reveal webinar. I know a few attendees are still joining, but in the interest of time, we'll get started. So again, welcome everyone. Let's start with the real truth, right? Most teams won't admit. The biggest bottlenecks engineering teams often face aren't always in the code. They are often in the compliance tasks. Evidence is scattered across multiple tools, last minute audit requests, unclear ownership. I've seen it personally at Fastly, Palo Alto Networks, at Symantec. So no matter what company you are in, it's fair game that you probably have seen it somewhere. Teams are often working late to keep up, and all this probably sounds familiar to a number of you, which is why you're on this call. Now imagine flipping that. What if compliance could actually accelerate your delivery, reduce your risk, and give your execs the confidence that the controls are actually working? That exactly what our panelists have done. Right? They've survived real audit crises, they've automated the tedious work, and they've turned compliance into a business advantage. But before we dive into the tech stacks and automation hacks, let's make this real. Let's send out a quick poll to see which of these are creating the biggest drag for your team today. So where does compliance create the biggest burden for you? Go ahead and vote. I will unpack the results after you complete. While we do that, let's introduce today's panelists, seasoned security and engineering leaders. I'm going to start with myself. I'm the moderator for today's discussion. I'm the SVP of product here at Scrut. Nearly 2 decades of experience in cybersecurity, working companies like Fastly, Palo Alto Networks, Informatica, and Symantec. Let's introduce today's panelists. Alpha, Siavash, and Avnish, do you want to introduce yourself in that order?
Hey everyone, my name is Alpha Diallo. I'm currently a product security engineer after moving from leadership back into an individual contributor role. Previously, I was the security engineering manager at a company called Spot Hero, where I was building out and leading the security team there. So responsible for all aspects of security from AppSec to cloud security compliance efforts as well. And so while I was there, I was leading our PCI compliance efforts as well as starting our SOC 2 efforts as well. So pleasure to meet you all.
My name is Siavash. I'm the CISO at Shift Labs. I lead our global security and compliance strategy. My background is in technology, security, and AI. I have a master of technology in software engineering and one master of science in AI. And I have guided multiple ISO 27001, SOC 2, HIPAA, FDA certifications across many industries, including retail, ad tech, and healthcare.
Hi, my name is Avnish, and I'm the engineering director here at Scrut Automation. Began my career at RSA and Siemens, gaining expertise in networking and cybersecurity. As a principal engineer with experience across network diagnostics and forensics, I've helped teams build secure cloud-native systems before I joined Scrut as an engineering leader. Not exactly pro in compliance space, but I've got my fair share of experience working here at Scrut. That would be me.
Thanks, Avnish. Definitely different perspectives and different vast amount of experience here. Also, just some general housekeeping as we kind of get started here. We are recording this session. We will have the Q&A tab for your questions, and we'll pick them up live. We have a focus session towards the end. And also watch for these polls. These polls are really good. It's interactive. It's an opportunity for you to have your voice heard. So do share that. With that, maybe do we want to close the first poll and see the results? It is telling. We do see quite a bit around. I think certainly there is one around evidence collection being prominent, but certainly the remaining half is in other areas. So certainly it's a very interesting result from here, just to kind of illustrate that how differently tension can play out depending upon who you are, where you sit in the organization, and what company you are in as well. But let's step back. What is the full compliance? Firstly, thank you for the feedback there. But let's step back and let's look at what a full stack compliance and engineering stack will look like when you zoom out, and where are the pressure points and where do teams really break down. So let's get into that. Maybe the first question I want to just poll to this audience, maybe Siavash, you can start. Where do you see compliance create the biggest burden for your organization today? And what, if any, are your compliance blind spots?
Honestly, I'm gonna say that I don't see any part of compliance as a burden. I think it helps the entire organization to follow a roadmap that is very well defined. However, if I wanted to talk about blind spots, I think like everyone else in the poll set, 50% of the poll set, I think collecting evidence is one of the biggest parts. There are many different parts in your organization, your tech stack, in your HR, that you have to go and start collecting evidences, and you cannot wholly automate all of that. And the second part, the blind spot for me personally, is where the employees are using their company credentials for using SaaS platforms. So that is one of the biggest blind spots for me.
Love to get a different perspective. Alpha, how do you see it from your perspective?
I'd have to agree there in terms of evidence collection, especially for organizations that maybe have not introduced like any sort of automation tools or tools to actually help collect some of this evidence, right? I've had to go through this experience where we were working out of some spreadsheets, right? And that kind of gets overwhelming at some point, having to go in and essentially figure out where you need to collect evidence from, where you want to store it, and all of that. And outside of that, just I think areas of in terms of sprawl and understanding the environments that are under scope for some of these audits. I've had experiences where essentially we were in the middle of an audit, we went through a scan of a system, didn't necessarily know about, and that essentially was going to lead to some sort of an audit failure. And so because we didn't have that initial understanding of that system being under scope and some of the configurations that were on that system, that was something that we needed to actually get through from that perspective. We definitely have to agree with Siavash there, evidence collection, and then just understanding of your systems and your SaaS systems as well.
Understood. And maybe switching perspectives from an engineering standpoint, Avnish, what is maybe a hardest compliance roadblock maybe you have faced, and what has it taught you as well?
I actually have a story that's still a bit painful for me to recollect, but basically gave us a crucial lesson. Sometime in our compliance journey, we had this grand and slightly naive idea that we could handle our first SOC 2 audit smoothly along with our sprint cadence in parallel. Because we thought it just takes a couple of people, right? You dedicate resources, the people who have the know-how, and they handle everything, and how hard will it be? But yeah, we quickly realized that was not the case. Three things hit us at the exact same time. First, our entire engineering team was deep in trenches for a UAT of a massive platform-wide revamp. Bandwidth was a premium. Second, an RFP from a dream client in the fintech space landed on our desk. Something, a massive opportunity for us to ignore or let go. And third, that was exactly at the same time when the audit actually officially kicked off. So yeah, we went all in. And what happened was that the first casualty out of it was the RFP. The sales team needed proof, reports, documentation of the controls. All that information existed, but basically in the heads of people in the know-how, some senior engineers who were already drowned in the UAT feedback loops that we were getting into. That's something we lost. The audit itself, the dedicated team, which was supposed to work in isolation, quickly realized that they needed evidence from all concerned, from everybody basically. So they started pulling in engineering folks, the same ones dealing with the feedback issues from the UAT. And the manual evidences, of course, the hunt began and it just turned into a chaotic process for us. But the interesting part was our Jira boards never got impacted. Surprisingly, nobody would be able to say that there was an impact on our sprint velocity. But the feeling within the team itself was like we had all had the wind knocked out of us. All of us were running on fumes, to put it very straight and simple. We realized that day, that very instant, that compliance is a team sport, not a side quest that you assign a couple of people and get by. It basically takes a village. Yeah, that's basically what we learned and basically the exposure that we've had the first time. And the blockages noticed.
No, it makes sense. I think you certainly walk through what can break when compliance is an afterthought. Maybe what are one or two things that you think on the learning side that maybe you have incorporated in compliance as a part of the dev cycle that maybe you want to share?
So I think the biggest takeaway from all this was that if basically you don't automate, there's going to be a hindrance for creativity and innovation at work. Developers basically like finiteness in what they operate on. And basically, unless it's a checkpoint for them in a journey, if it's a task assigned, it would become really difficult for them to be good at what they do. That's basically shipping out better and cooler products, and yet powering forward and making sure that all the compliance controls are checked. So I think we realized that if we make it a part of the process and basically make sure that automation is aid all along, I think also incentivizing the developers, of course, to work towards it. That basically was our biggest takeaway from all this.
Understood. That makes sense. And maybe Alpha, going back to you, like looking at the stories that Avanish has had, and certainly assume you've had similar with the teams that you worked with on the engineering side. How do you strike the balance between the regulatory obligations and having to support like fast-moving engineering teams? And I worked in early stage companies as well. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think first thing is essentially understanding what needs to be done from in terms of the requirements, right? If the security team or the compliance team does not understand what needs to be done, you can't go to the engineering teams and tell them like this is what needs to be done, right? So that's the first thing I would essentially say. After that, just ensuring that you do actually explain to those engineering teams, okay, these are things that need to be done. This is why we're actually recommending them, and this is what the potential impact could actually be if these things are not done. Right? It's not, and it's actually bringing them up to speed so that nothing is sprung up on them at the very last minute. I believe that's the thing that teams would hate the most, right? You come to them last minute and say, "We need this with urgency, and you have to do it now." Right, that is not going to create a good relationship with that team going forward afterward. So for me, an example of this would be with the newer PCI requirements that came out and that we're going to go into effect, I believe earlier this year, back in March. In terms of for our team, it was more so understanding, okay, what are the things that we need to do to actually meet these new requirements, actually writing out the different areas that we needed to work on, and then trying to subdivide, okay, what can security fully take on from our perspective so that we can actually help the engineering teams and they don't need to have to worry about those things. And then what are the things that the engineering teams actually have to do from their side? And then bringing that up to them a couple quarters or even quarter or two beforehand, and then just letting them know that, hey, these are things that we need to do. And this is what our project plan currently looks like. Is there any sort of feedback from this? Is this going to impact you guys in any way? And how can we actually get this slotted within your own roadmap, just so that we actually have time to complete it and also make sure that we test it there. So I think more so it's just making sure that the teams are aware at the very onset and that nothing is being brought to them at the last minute. Sometimes you can't help it, but the more you can try to bring it to them beforehand, I think the more they'll actually appreciate it and the more they'll actually want to work with you to actually get these things done.
Understood. No, yes, certainly understanding the requirement is certainly key. I can see that. Number two, like bringing them along the way, not throwing surprises. That's certainly the, and then clear transparency and planning and accountability. I think definitely great ways in which you can kind of bring collaborative effort towards this process. Maybe let's peel the onion a little bit more, right? Let's break down the tech stack, and maybe there's the infrastructure, the identity, the CI/CD pipeline, the endpoints, the SaaS security aspects of it, data and privacy aspects of it. So every organization has some form of tech stack that kind of resembles what's on the screen, right? But the controls, the gaps, and risks are going to be very different, I can imagine, depending on what company you are, where you are geographically, and whom you serve as well. So again, another question, maybe a good question for people to voice out, is where do you really find yourself least confident about compliance today? Do voice yourself from this expo. While the team does that, again, the question for you, Siavash, from your engagement with the customers that Shift Labs has, and even maybe from prior experiences, where do you see buyers pushing the hardest on compliance proof during deals?
I think we all have seen those very long questionnaires that takes hours and hours to fill out. And I think that's natural. So every company really cares about what they're going to be dealing with, the company that they're going to be working with, are they secure, how they are going about their data security, access, and list privileges. So I think most thing that I see in those questions are around the same things: vendor management, encryption, cloud infrastructure, segmentation. And recently, actually, I've been seeing that there are more and more questions about office policies, how people can get into the office, how everything is being logged. And I believe that, again, some people see this as a burden, but always believe that if we are being asked these questions, it means that those companies themselves are going to be asked the same question. So it's just a chain of compliance, and we're just part of that.
It makes sense. Alpha, maybe a different question for you. Which parts of the stack do you think come under the heaviest auditor scrutiny for you, and what are some of the reasons for that?
Yeah, I think a couple that are at least two that I've generally seen the most. One is going to be around the identity space. Just more so, they want to ensure that organizations are not just giving everyone admin access to everything. No one just has free reign within the organization, and that companies are actually taking care when it does come to access, especially when we look at sort of companies that have a bunch of SaaS applications. And if they're not managing that user lifecycle, and in terms of you have employees that maybe are no longer employees of the organization and they still somehow end up having access to all these systems. So that's definitely one area where I'm seeing a lot of scrutiny from. Other portion I would say is more so around like the policies that an organization has and what sort of enforcement they have in place. Right. Organizations, depending, they'll have policies in place. Sometimes those policies are just there. They're gathering dust. Nobody's really looking at them. When you look at sort of the controls that you have, maybe they don't actually match up with what's within the policies. And maybe the policies haven't been updated in a while. So I think when we're going through some of these audits and auditors are asking for policies and then asking questions around those, that's definitely an area where I do see that. And so just the importance of making sure your policies are updated, you actually understand what's in them, and you do have some sort of enforcement for them as well.
Makes sense. I think identity thing often comes up. I've seen it from my experiences, the principle of least privilege, trying to enforce that and access reviews into the various applications and managing that is certainly a big area of risk exposure, and definitely can imagine that being a big key part of your audit scrutiny. Let's look at the survey results, the poll results. What do we have here? I did not see there. There we go. Oh, this is very telling. So alpha looks like maybe it is correct. Yes. Managing user identities and access roles seems to be not a big unknown, but certainly that's an area where people do focus on. Maybe that's why. But you do see a big fragmentation of various different things literally spread across the spectrum here. Let me just double click here. Security and cloud infrastructure makes sense. Oversight of SaaS apps, definitely shadow IT and the number of apps, big unknown. And endpoint security, data security, and vendor risk certainly are pretty even. Yeah, I think the app sprawl seems to be the one that's taking the cake here as the biggest area of compliance exposure. Maybe, Avnish, from your perspective, where do you see compliance requirements causing duplication of effort, drag on your team, and a lot of inefficiencies?
I would say in the CI/CD pipeline itself, starts right in the repos, GitHub, for an example. We require peer reviews for code changes, which is the standard practice. The drag comes when in the audit process, rather, we have to manually create a report or spreadsheet proving that these reviews have actually happened. The evidence is there for everybody's consumption, yet there's a manual process involved. So that's a duplicity of effort and wastage of time that really hurts and also defeats the entire purpose, if I may put it mildly. Ditto for the QA folks. The test cases need a manual sign off. There's a heavy reliance on figureheads, basically giving them the go ahead, where everything is actually very obvious and in your face. Vulnerability management, I would say, by that the typical shift left scenario where you would have your sneaks of the world, the dependabots of the world, that would find a critical vulnerability in the open source library right off the bat. And the developer might be inclined to quickly patch it based on the CVSS score, the severity of the issue reported. But once he does that, there is a manual effort again for him to basically trace it back to the Jira board it came from, the source of truth, basically, provide the right context to all concerned, and only then the issue closes. Yeah, I think these two items, aside from these two, I would say use cases that rely probably entirely on human discipline, if we may call it, something like a change management evidence. So every production deployment probably has a control that needs to be satisfied in terms of an approved change request before it moves to the production from the release branch. Via a Jira ticket, somebody actually needs to do the hard yard, go back and update that. Proving the least privilege access. Also, the poll said that's least of our concerns, but somehow heavily that's something that fits right in. The auditors most of the times throw this question as to us that, hey, show me who had the permissions to modify the production database per quarter when done over a year, of course, where the expectation is that the evidence procurement is per quarter. So an access review per quarter is what they allude to. And answering that simply with a a screenshot doesn't cut it. You have to probably get involved in a forensic manhunt of sorts to get out the deployment service accounts, the old audit logs, and the works. So all of these are basically examples of immense drag and wastes valuable time is what I see. And this could be very well avoided if there's a well-instrumented system which can just be queried for relevant information. So yeah, that's my take.
Makes sense. And I think the audience survey, I think partly is the user identity piece is probably where everybody focuses on. So it's not an unknown, but it's just that it's just the most hardest to be on top of, given the nature of the risk that it presents in continuously shifting there. And maybe that's a good question for maybe, again, back to Siavash. Like when you look at this, how do you decide where you want to spend? You have finite budgets versus where you would live with like the residual risk, especially from a CISO perspective. It's all about risk management and balancing it. How do you think about where to spend and where you would live with residual risk?
I think the answer is pretty simple. We as a company, we measure risk in terms of commercial impact, and that very easily can be translated to business impact. So if there's a gap, if there's a residual risk that can stall a deal, that can stop the show or fail an audit, then it's worth investment. But if it's like a theoretical edge case that doesn't have that much of visibility, then I think probably the best decision is to just document it and accept it formally, make it known, and move on. So again, the key is making the risk a business decision versus just a security decision. I think that is how you bring the focus of the organization and the management to what is happening right here instead of just the CISO making a decision and moving on.
Of course, that makes sense. You're bringing in the overall holistic business impact aspect of it. Are there, just a double click on that, are there things that you're translating risks into commercial impact? You've had challenges in translating that into something that is a business impact? Love to hear maybe some examples that you may have had that you can share.
We have actually residual risk. I would talk about this was more of we have SLAs and the company for when we have vulnerabilities in our stack, when we find vulnerabilities in our code, if it is critical, if it is high, if it is medium, how much time it takes for us and how much time do we have to fix those. And I think in the first year of our compliance of our company, we were like 30%, 40% of time, we were just missing those SLAs. So we just made it formal, made it known to the team that, hey, this is what's happening. We understood what was the reason behind that, why we were just missing to fix a medium critical vulnerability longer than, I don't know, a week. And then we just tried to build the organization culture around it and then fix it in the next year. But we made it known to the organization.
Sounds good. But yeah, let's make this tangible. Maybe let's look at the stack now from 3 simple lenses, right? Maybe controls, things that you can do for guardrails that every framework has, like multi-factor authentication, encryption, logging, backups. Risks, these are the messy realities when controls aren't always consistent. Maybe an old engineer account slips through, a repo doesn't get scanned, or a SaaS problem we talked about creates some blind spots, and where compliance headache really start, right? And automation. This is where instead of engineers chasing screenshots and spreadsheets, we have integrations that can enforce controls, pulls evidence in real time, flag risks before auditors flag it. And the end result is to really drive lower risk. Engineers are free to be billed, faster deals, because compliance is no longer a critical roadblock in the process. That's the shift, right? From compliance chaos to really driving collaborations. From maybe Alpha, from your perspective, what are some of the controls that are like truly non-negotiable from your perspective to continuously monitor and prove that they work to your auditors?
So I want to go back and touch on maybe like in terms of monitoring your identity lifecycle, right? Across all of your different tools, and even as we can see here from across all the different stacks that you may have, right? It's not just within one single area around maybe your corporate infrastructure. It's within your cloud systems, within your CI/CD when we're talking about access keys and things like that, right? So definitely monitoring of your identity lifecycle and what the different controls that you do have there. And then what was mentioned earlier around vulnerabilities and the misconfigurations, right? So how are you actually detecting all of these things? Do you have some sort of a scanner, especially maybe within your cloud environment if you're a cloud native company, right? How are you finding all these things? How are you dealing with them? And then within your applications as well, like we get tons of vulnerabilities that get reported not only from first party perspective around the code that your developers are writing, but from a supply chain perspective as well. How do you deal with those? How do you triage them? How are you prioritizing? Because not all of those vulnerabilities are going to be things that you actually are going to be able to take care of. So it's very important that you actually end up prioritizing them and then actually figure out what actions have been taken to remediate it and whether or not that remediation ends up causing any additional issues as well. So those are just two areas I would definitely think about when we think about different controls there.
And as you talked about, sorry, was there another point of view?
No.
All right. No, as you just described, driving automation. So I'm hearing some noise on my end. When automation floods you, especially with so many alerts potentially, you talked about vulnerability management, cloud infrastructure findings, potentially other tools. What's been some ways in which kind of separating the real risk from the noise? What has been some approaches you have taken that really drives focus and working with engineering, you said, and getting them to work on the right things to address?
Yeah, I think one was initially just understanding what the systems was in terms of like how critical it is actually to our business. And then some of the tooling, one of the things I always look for within the toolings is how it actually helps our organization prioritize the things that it's actually finding. So when we look at like code analysis or SaaS tooling, right? One of the things I'm very excited about, or at least will look for, is that reachability aspect of code, right? Is this something that's actually reachable by somebody? And because that, for me, that it helps eliminate a large portion of the vulnerabilities that we're initially finding, and then just try to focus on those, and then based off of our ethic criteria, try to narrow down on those vulnerabilities as well. Definitely the understanding of the system that you're actually dealing with or you're getting these alerts from and the criticalities of business, and then also the prioritization aspect of things, especially from a tooling perspective, and then whatever additional internal criteria the organization may have. Those are the things I've actually generally used to help in terms of just dealing with a massive number of alerts that teams are getting.
Definitely. I think my past experience having worked and launched products like data loss prevention, cloud security, data security, just the alert fatigue is a big challenge, right? And also in terms of really risk management, really getting to the bottom of what you really want to focus on is critical. And getting that in the system, helping you really narrow down to really focus on the right things in the right order to get the biggest bang, get the biggest impact, certainly is going to be critical in driving success here. Ish, from your perspective, like where has automation, you talked about a few use cases, key manual steps, where automation has really saved you time, has driven more successful audit readiness, risk reduction, but it's actually cut the effort instead of just moving it around. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
So interestingly, a lot of our features are basically built through the pain point we suffer during our engineering processes. So that's something that we have started to do and with reasonable amount of success. For instance, the evidence gathering, which all of us have in the panel been talking about, the evidence gathering for access review for tools such as the GitHub and the AWS, it has to be a continuous background job. It cannot be once in a time stopgap arrangement of such. So once that happens, we don't have to spend time and effort to satisfy a control. You are basically doing it on a fairly regular basis, on an incremental basis. That way, we are almost audit ready where there is a need, and all you need to do is basically collate evidences and present the same. So that's a strategy we have figured, a methodology we have figured which works for us and has paid rich dividends, I would say, with reasonable amount of success. The actual risk reduction by being proactive in looking at the security vectors, which Alpha and Siavash referred to in some capacity, cloud configuration drift, the monitoring of the stacks themselves, the APMs of the world, all of that basically play a part. And I believe that investing time and effort in this has paid rich dividends for us. Yeah, that's the way we are taking it.
Sounds good. No, it's good. And maybe it's a question for all three of you. As automation becomes more central to compliance, which areas are you still relying on human judgment and oversight? And how do you ensure that this doesn't create more residual risk? Maybe Siavash, maybe you can start with your thoughts.
I think still anything that requires context, that's where automation cannot really help us. And I think that's also the biggest vibe of the day, AI context. Anywhere that machines cannot decide or don't understand, that is where we need human in the loop. And this human in the loop is not a new thing. Like we've had it in the healthcare, in medtech particularly. I remember, we were building a tool to detect thyroid nodules by using artificial intelligence. And it was very accurate, about 98% accuracy we had. But still, we needed that human in the loop because the context was unknown to the machine. A very simple example from the normal stack that every company has these days. We have an EC2 instance on an AWS VPC, and this EC2 instance has a port 22 open to the world. And we are getting the alerts that port 22 is open to the world. But is it? So the context is this port 22 is behind a security group. That security group is behind a routing table inside a VPC. VPC has its own rules, etc. And practically, no traffic can reach this machine from outside. And this port is only open to those who need it and have been authenticated to the AWS environment. So obviously, this alert is not a false alarm, but I wouldn't prioritize attending it.
Understood. Makes sense. That's a really good example. Kind of walking through that scenario there. Alpha, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so just follow up on that context side of things, definitely around like the vulnerabilities and the things that you're actually getting from your different tools, right? There definitely will need to be a person involved, especially because for some of these vulnerabilities, right, you don't want to just do like an auto remediation type of thing that may end up breaking some of your systems. So definitely the context there, as Shivash kind of mentioned there. And then the other portion where you do have to have at least still manual effort is definitely around maybe like the policies and their effectiveness to the organization, and just looking at that portion there. You may have metrics around certain things that are within your policies, but then how do you understand like whether or not that they're actually fully effective as well? So
Understood. And from your thoughts from an engineering perspective, how do you see that?
Yeah, I think Siavash hit the nail in the head when he called out the context, right? I think all of us grapple with it. On similar lines, in a very engineering heavy conversation, it would also basically allude to whatever you do on a regular basis, in the sense, if you are coming up with a architectural, a revamp of sorts or a redesign of sorts, you must have some kind of security and architecture guardrail, which in present world would entail human intervention. Unless we get there with AI where it seamlessly takes over and helps out, it's always manual gatekeeping, slows down the process a little, but that's a very sacrosanct part of engineering pipeline where you must have manual intervention. Yeah.
Yes. So it makes perfect sense. In my experience, I think it's usually a combination of the context and consequences, right? Context definitely is important. And what are the consequences if you have automation into your process? There are going to be certain things where the business benefits may outweigh. I think AI is a good example of when we use it for certain purposes. It can outweigh potentially giving you a confidently wrong answer. And how do you really use it? Definitely something that is very contextual how you can think about it. Good discussion there. And this is kind of where we, again, a little plug in a Scrat here. We really want to turn these blockers into enablers, controls feeding into the evidence automatically. You want to be able to surface risks easily and early, and also having engineers really focus on the day-to-day of what they need to do versus having to chase down compliance tasks that they're assigned. So maybe just to explore how automation actually cut audit cycles by weeks, accelerated deals. To get maybe another poll question, if you could fully automate one outcome, this may be tied to what you probably shared earlier, but which one do you think would move the needle most in your company, in your organizations? I'll go to a survey, maybe a question for you, Siavash. How has automation changed your board conversations? And maybe even to preface that, to what extent are you leveraging automation today within your processes related to where you want to be? And are you really focusing on risk trends? Are you focusing on audit checklists? How have you gone through that journey?
Automation gives you more ammunition when you're going to the board meeting. You have more things to talk about. You have numbers to provide. The decisions will become data-driven. When you have automation, you have a dashboard. On the dashboard, you can actually show your risk register, your posture trends. You can show the number of things that were fixed, number of controls that we have in place, number of integrations that we have added, vendors that we have rejected to be used organization-wide. And this automatically translates into why we need budget of this much for next year, or what's next in our roadmap and why that is in our roadmap, because everything is data-driven again. And I'm saying it several times. You do not go into the room with the great news, we are compliant, we have our certifications, but you are making everybody in the board a contributor to the compliance journey. So that is what automation does for me personally.
Understood. No, that's great. I think building that trust and also thinking about where you want to go with it for budgetary conversations makes sense. And Alpha, from like, where do you see automation like improve trust from an auditing perspective, from a compliance, working with compliance auditors? Do you see them still want manual evidence? What's the state of affairs today?
Yeah, not necessarily, especially when they understand the automation tool that we're actually utilizing. I do think in those cases it helps build the trust because one thing is like the automation makes things repeatable manner, right? You're essentially collecting similar evidence, it's doing things the same way. With sort of the manual process when people are essentially going through and collecting evidence that we're going to be utilizing, I think sometimes you may end up having some difficulties, especially based off of who may be collecting the evidence and also based off of their understanding of the requirement that they're trying to meet. You may have two people collect separate pieces of evidence, which maybe then it could be an issue. Even though the auditors may trust the tools, sometimes they may still want some of that manual evidence or for you to actually walk them through some of those things. But I think that's easier said, or that's easy, right? And especially if they already have some of that initial evidence there. So really, I think just from an automation perspective, it's just help build trust and just help them go through their audits a lot faster as well.
Yes. And as you build automation, things can break. So what guardrails do you put to make sure like automation doesn't really disrupt your developer experience?
I think as a contextual rule, anything that, I mean, anything that can be contextualized as a fast actionable item should be automated. So I'll probably help drive my point with examples. For a developer, that means a security scan that finishes in seconds and it basically points to the exact line of code where he needs to make his fix at. So that's immediate actionable item, and that's a good guardrail for him to have. Similarly, it's just as critical for a QA automation engineer. An end-to-end test which runs or rather fails in the pipeline should basically not disrupt the entire workflow. The report must actually capture details around what has broken so that it can be immediately taken up in isolation. And the pipeline also, the reporting pipeline also doesn't fail. It basically proceeds to the next task so that there are some checks done, if not all, right? Similarly, I would say the security scanners, CI/CD pipelines, the automated test suites, these are readily accessible. We try and make it readily accessible to everybody in our organization. This makes the guardrails transparent. So what it does is for a QA engineer, it implies that he needs to maybe adjust test environment configuration immediately to get his work done. He can go ahead and do that. For a dev, if there's a quick security rule that needs to be tuned and he can raise a PR and get it sorted, he can get that done, right? So shared ownership over the entire security and the quality pipe process, I would say, is basically how we are trying to not disrupt the experience of all concerned, not only devs, but everybody in the pipeline, basically.
So that's good. That makes sense. I'd love to see the results of the poll as well. What has been the answer? All right, let's look at this. Again, pretty differentiated responses here. Automating capture of incident response logs takes the cake there. Continuous monitoring SaaS, I think it resounds with these the shadow IT and app sprawl and access reviews. I think there's probably a team that sees that as a key pain point in the audit group as well. But I can kind of see it across the spectrum. There is lots of opportunities for automation, and given the diversity, like leveraging it, even in incremental steps towards achieving improved efficiencies, for like taking baby steps towards that. Maybe posing the same question back to the team here. Maybe Siavash, Shinal, for like where would be the areas of automation that you're not doing today, or if you had to recommend that to the team, if you're already doing today, that would be the biggest commercial impact.
I will take that first. I think one thing that I would love to see automated, but it is very difficult, is access reviews on proprietary systems. Access review is not a very difficult thing to be automated. Those, I don't know, Okta, Google workspaces, roles, policies, everything, these are not too difficult. But when it comes to or cloud infrastructure, CI/CD pipelines, all of these is pretty easy to automate and do the access review pretty fast. But when it comes to proprietary systems like internal VPN, or you have databases on dev environment that developers need direct access to for running queries, getting the list of people who have access to that and then comparing it with the last year and then making it a proper access review is always very hassleful, at least for me. And it takes a lot of time from everybody in my team. And I would love if this could be automated. This is one thing that would move the needle the most for me.
Good example there. How about you, Anish and Alpha?
I think for me, it's more so maybe just around like the SaaS applications in terms of understanding the users, the level of permissions they have, as well as the configurations and how those applications, SaaS applications are configured to ensure that we're not at risk of any potential like data leakage by exposing too much information or by allowing people from outside our organization to actually have access to it. So that'd be the one area for me.
And maybe lastly, Avnish, and then I'd like to turn the table to the audience. Avnish, any key thing that you would love to see automated?
Oh, I'm so sorry. So I think I alluded to earlier, maybe if there were to be a provision or if there was AI co-pilot of sorts, which could prompt the engineer around the security or architecture guardrails to consider when he or she is putting an effort in optimizing or redesigning or developing something from the scratch, that would be of immense value and help. Saves manpower and basically saves all the hassles that could percolate in the system later. So yeah, certainly that. I think Sevash basically alluded to very difficult to do that, have context built out. But yeah, in an ideal world, if something of that sort can happen, why not? That would be immensely helpful.
Thanks. I think good examples there. I want to turn the table now a little bit. So now is the opportunity for our attendees. What's really on your mind, whether that's some messy tooling questions on something or comments on something that the panelists had raised. Love to get the feedback. Again, no question is off limits here that's around this topic. Yeah, pick the brain of our experts. With that, I will ensure that the Q&A section is enabled and we can start polling questions there. Let me see if there are any questions already. I'm going to go through these questions live and feel free to have the questions coming. What kind of developer work is the automation recommended for in order to reduce fatigue and support compliance? What kind of developer work? I'm trying to still follow the question. What kind of developer work is what kind of developer work for which automation is recommended to reduce alert fatigue? Got it. All right. Who wants to take this question? Maybe Avnish. Of this, but what kind of developer work do you think automation would be recommended?
Although I'm not too sure if I understood the question, but I think automated tests, automated scans and reviews of the code is something that developers can make themselves more and more familiar with and become well versed in. It just cuts the cost and effort down the line in the software development lifecycle. So the development is not anymore only about writing code. It's also about testing. It's also about reviewing the code, and it's also about peer reviewing, as Avnish referred to at the beginning of this webinar. So that is, hopefully I got the question correctly, but this is what I think that the devs could put a little bit more effort into.
I think that's right. I think they reframed the question. That seems right. That if there's any further questions, feel free to put it on the chat. The other question, maybe as you're on CISOs, this is to the question we alluded to earlier. How do you know when to accept residual risk versus spending on yet another tool? You talked about the business commercial aspect. If you have anything to add on this one,
yet another tool.
I think is it okay to accept residual risk versus spending money to procure another tool to potentially manage the risk? Is probably what the question is.
Oh yeah, okay. So I'm gonna go back to the answer that I gave already. If it's a showstopper, if we cannot seal the deal with that risk in place, with that gap not being addressed, then definitely you have to go ahead and bridge it. You cannot just dismiss something that is gonna haunt you later. In one of those questionnaires, in those 7-8 hours that you're going to be filling out, one question is going to be asking you, do you do this? And then you cannot lie. And obviously overnight, you cannot go fix it either. So this is how we can make a decision. If somebody asks me about this, and if I tell that, no, we don't do this, or yes, we do this, what's the difference? And I think that will give you a very logical answer to whether you have to invest or not.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And the next question here, what's the downside of leaning too much on automation and losing the human context? And how important is it? A good question from an auditor perspective. Who wants to take this one?
I think there is one risk. Sorry, I'm taking all of these questions. I think one risk is once you automate everything and everything is working and you're not getting too many alarms, It just gives you the feeling that everything is fine. It does not necessarily mean that it's not, but you won't go back and take a look at the actual infrastructure. Or your cadences just gets smaller and smaller. Instead of once a week, it becomes once a month. And then after a few months, all of a sudden you realize that something was there that shouldn't have been. And just because you were relying too much on the automation and because you didn't get any alarms, now instead of having a few days worth of work, you have a month worth of work. So obviously context, obviously human in the loop, you should never remove the human from the loop. And this is how I would approach it.
No, makes sense. I think this is, again, a very important thing about like how you scale. As a business scales, there's going to be only to a certain extent you can have all tasks scaled by from human scale standpoint. So you have to leverage automation. Number two is looking at the context, right? I think as you said, areas where humans are still better, where whether it's AI or automation doesn't serve, it maybe you want to keep it human. And two is the third is the hybrid, right? Where how do you keep that human in the loop in most cases? So I think the gravity is as you scale, you will need to drive in a lot more automation, whether that's a choice or a necessity. And number two, yeah, maintaining the right level of human context. And that's something that will vary based on context and consequences, as we talk about. It's a very fair question to ask. All right, couple more questions here. Compliance isn't a one-day task, as highlighted by Avnish and other panelists. How should the team look at inculcating it in the sprint items? Automation is key, but findings reported from such tools can throw plans haywire. Maybe a question for Avnish. How do you see some of what has worked and maybe any recommendations for this answer?
It's a catch-22 for sure. You have to take care of your sprint obligations or your product obligations on one hand, while there's always this added pressure of fixing things that you're breaking along the line. The way I see it, you should not treat security as a noise. It's basically an additional sprint task, if I may say so, if that's a question covering from a developer's perspective, and probably an important ask from the products or rather the security standpoint. So I would say a healthy mix, maybe a security expert could be useful here. Maybe the senior engineering leadership team could be the one gatekeeping this, but there has to be some triage of the security issues, some grooming of it, because that would also imply not only your attack vector being reduced, but also you graduating towards a better posture in terms of your compliance journey, alternatively. So I would say a healthy mix of both needs to be done. That's something that we also try and follow. Not easy to practice, I must say. There's always this pushback and you've always to weigh your options very carefully. But equally important and to be taken up very seriously, groomed on a fairly regular basis. SLAs, every organization has their own SLAs, so probably let that be the benchmark for how you dictate the grooming of such issues. So a combination of all that.
No, very fair. I think this is probably alluding to some of what I think Alpha mentioned earlier, right? You can source a lot of different items, findings that you can get from various tools before you get to the engineering where it can become a big bottleneck and have engineering work. How do you really triage it appropriately, really prioritize it, contextualize it, what is really important and when, so people can really plan around it. So I think doing that legwork early with the right level of rigor can just drive a reduced impact. And the other day, if these are critical things, it's not hey, should I do it or not? It's a matter of how we plan this, like I said, as a security sprint on its own to factor into your overall sprint planning as well. I'll probably take a couple more questions. I know we're getting close to the end of the hour. The next one here is, when compliance obligation clash with how engineers actually ship code, what's the right compromise? Maybe I'll leave that to you, Avnish, and maybe we can wrap after that for the time.
Yeah, so there's no concept of right compromise here. I believe that you have to ship code and meet your compliance obligation. I think I alluded to a little while earlier, although hard to practice, easier to preach. But if we can find that middle ground where the compliance journey becomes a part of the daily conversation, it's just one of the checkpoints like a PRD, writing unit test cases. If it becomes that organic for each team, I certainly believe then it stops becoming a hindrance. You stop treating compliance as a hindrance and just accept it as part of the process. Something I think Siavash also alluded to earlier. Treat it as an ally, not an enemy, and basically just get your processes right around it. So That's the crux of it.
Thanks, Avnish. And again, really appreciate everybody joining. Again, the conversation doesn't have to end here. Do stay connected. Join our Slack community. I think it's truly a community where we want to be able to exchange tips, feedback, guidance. People who have gone through this journey may have suggestions. Yeah, and connect with us on LinkedIn as well. You have our contact information. Add us, connect with us, reach out to us. Also, a big thank to our panelists for bringing real stories, insights, and thank to all of you for spending so much time of your day with us. If this conversation hit home and you want to see it in action with what we are doing from a Scrut perspective, some of successful customer stories we have had, book a demo and I can kind of show you how Scrut really is built to automate the heavy lifting. Get the playbook as well. We have a compliance automation toolkit, again, with some practical tips to get started. If there are any questions, again, do reach out to us. Until next time, and the next seminar, the next session in the series, stay secure, stay compliant, and yeah, hope to see you soon.